You're listening to Blind Shovel, an arts and music podcast. Today I have the honor of speaking with comic artist Brandon Graham. Hope you enjoy.
Hey, Michael.
What's up?
How's it going?
Good. How you doing?
Good.
You sleep all right today?
I think so. Yeah. sorry to get you to make you contend with my weird schedule.
No, that's all good. I'm kind of fascinated by that. Has it always been like that for you?
I mean, kind of. Yeah. I mean, I haven't had a 9 to 5 and since like 2005 or something. So my schedule kind of rotates.
And so left to your own devices, you got a wild sleep schedule. Yeah,
I don't think it's healthy. I'm getting close to 50 and I'm starting to think that waking up and seeing the sun is a better option than living like a teenager.
Yeah, I think that's true. But, actually reading the diary, that's something I was thinking about a lot. Is this healthy in some sense? But it was also very interesting, much more than I think most comic artists' lives would be. But is there something, I don't know, like the porn aspect, that's Las Vegas, right?
Yeah.
It seems poetic in some perverse way as well, though. I don't know. How do you feel about all that in general?
I mean, it's a really mixed bag. I mean, I think I've met some really fascinating, cool people that are through the porn scene, like some of the best people I've met in the world. But it's not. I mean, I'd be lying if I thought it was a healthy industry. It's and because I've got to know just the porn scene and the comic book scene, they seem really related to each other.
Really? That's a connection I would never make, but that's a fascinating connection.
You just see kind of how community works and how both the positives and negatives of community and how both industries kind of have this veneer that there's a community, but are oftentimes very self-serving.
I feel that way about all, like, quote unquote community.
It's just
I think it's like I don't think it's real. I think before, when we actually had real community, we didn't even talk about it, And then there's these inorganic formations that we call community. And I don't even know what it means when I step back and think about it, or what it means to build a community. Like, I run an art center in New Jersey, and I think about what that means a lot. Like, how much can you control in that sense, as like what comes in and what comes out of something, of some ill-defined grouping of people. And like, I don't know what the comics community is, or like what, at your age, what the comics community is for you or was. And at my age, at 35, what I think of that community, But as I get older, I just drift further and further, in a good way, from any sense of being a part of that, I feel.
Yeah, I think that can be good. I think having your own life that's not too attached to necessarily to a larger grouping is nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's see. I feel like I was unpacking the porn thing, but I don't know where to go with that. But
no, that's fair. I can get rather tangential. No, the porn thing is very interesting, and it threw me for a loop. And that's what I liked about reading it. There's a lot of comic artist diaries that I personally don't find very interesting. But
I'm interested in what your impression of a comic artist diary, because I know diary comics have a really bad rap. Just the like, woke up, had a coffee,
Sure, yeah. That's fair. That's fair. I think, yeah, because the isolation does yield a fairly similar, like mundane physical environment. It's isolated to a room or something. There is some coffee. There's probably cats. There's probably self-loathing about the process itself.
Yeah, the self-loathing aspect of that's kind of a part of the comic book persona that I've tried to shake as much as possible. I mean, there's more in my diary book than I'd like, but
I think that's what I liked about reading it is there was recognizable patterns of someone who draws, or just relatable points like Mobius or Hergé, which I feel like are necessary for a good comic artist. They have to be there. But then there was stuff and there was coffee. I think there was some coffee. But then there was the environment and the porn, and then your girlfriend and the way that was unfolding. That alone was interesting. Just the various tensions, or this like semi-heroic element that this like it seems like you have foes that are contending with you or attacking you, and that all made for a very interesting read that I wasn't expecting. Now, granted, I'll be honest, and I actually like coming into these interviews with a good amount of ignorance. I know of your work, but I don't know. It's not like I know a ton about you or the work itself. So there's kind of something nice about that, where my real introduction is this diary comic.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, it's weird. I often think about like it's a weird thing producing work and putting it out there, because like your narcissism assumes that everybody's like knows enough about the work as much as you're putting out. But the reality is, even I have to remind myself that even artists whose work I'm obsessed about, like Mobius or Jay or something, like I could talk about them all day, but there's parts like I couldn't talk about Blueberry all day.
Sure.
Like I have blind spots still.
Yeah.
And I have to remind myself with my own work that like each new book you do can also be an introduction to the work.
And is it resolved? Is the diary done, or do you keep adding to it?
Yeah, I think I keep adding to it. I have this idea that I'm messing with now, which is basically the idea of how we anthropomorphize ideas sometimes. And it was kind of coupled with the idea of how in Spanish they'll kind of like a lot of inanimate objects get gendered.
Sure.
But my girlfriend was telling me that that's almost like a different. It's almost like a synonym, where it's like not necessarily like the fork is male or female, but it's like it's either A or B. So I was doing a diary comic just to kind of parse out that idea, and I was thinking like it's a lot of things where I was thinking like the idea of the concept of sweet and sour, like sweet seems like a nicer personality, but sour is more complicated and interesting. And it's interesting that that at least in my mind that I've assigned personalities to flavors.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think that's connected to comics in some way, because it's asking a lot of the reader to be like, here's Snoopy. He has a personality, even though it doesn't exist. And that's an interesting thing that our brains do. So yeah, to answer your question, just like the diary stuff is kind of an always ongoing thing for me, just because it does help me process things a lot. And I think it's a nice kind of companion to the comics I'm doing that are more distant from my life.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine that, I don't know, I don't keep a diary, but are there things that don't get put in a diary, or how's that discernment used? Like, it seemed pretty divulgent, but
yeah, there's a lot that doesn't. I mean, there's pages that cut out of it just because, sometimes, just like in telling a comic story, like, in telling kind of a fictional story, I feel like sometimes you start a thread and people want answers and they want more of it. So sometimes you're like, I don't want to start talking about this because people will need answers. Yeah, and even some stuff in there, I feel like some of my friends I showed it to was like, were like, you should explain this stuff more. And I always have to remind myself that kind of I think in storytelling, you owe emotional resolutions, but not always like explanations of everything. Like you can bore a reader, but if you stick to the emotional level of it, then hopefully they stick with you.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about what you owe. Because a diary, I hadn't considered how you would have to tailor a diary inevitably. It's not just some, free form expulsion of your pure self. It has to be framed in one way.
Yeah, and there's lots of stuff in there that like I keep, there's things that would make good diary comics, I think, that just I didn't need to process, so I didn't put them. My girlfriend talked to me about like we'd go to big kind of mansion porn parties in Las Vegas and have these like crazy nights hanging out with a bunch of weirdos and doing drugs and playing mini golf or whatever, and those would make interesting comics, but I don't think there's anything there for me to kind of work through. So there's no point in it. And some of it either sounds like too self-deprecating or like bragging, and I feel like I want to avoid that.
Bragging because you're in a porn mansion?
Yeah, but I mean, the reality is there's a depression to that, so it's not just like there's a lot of things you can say that are like you can experience something in your life and explain it to someone in a way that makes you sound great. But the attempt, I think, of the diary thing is to explain it what feels honest to me,
Yeah. No, I felt that there was some ambivalence about that whole situation.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I was just remembering myself. I have some friends that I introduced the term depression porn to my group of friends in Vegas, and one of them was kind of using it back to me, and I was like, I shouldn't have introduced that term to them, because if you look at it right, like a lot of this stuff can be depression porn.
Oh, sure. But how, what is, just trying to think about this. You said you're almost 50?
Yeah, 47.
Oh, okay. We got 3 years.
Yeah. A lot can go wrong.
How do you end up, okay, so like it's kind of funny because I feel like comedians somehow are always associated with porn and porn stars, but I definitely do not associate comic artists with it. But how do you end up there? And was it something intentional or desired?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, basically around when I was 40, I started hanging out with a girl in Canada who was she's a trans lady who was really into she had like favorite porn stars, and she would ask me like, oh, draw fan art of this girl or draw a picture of this girl. And so I was like, I would do pictures and then I'd just post them on Twitter and tag the people. And in doing that, I became friends with a porn performer named Natalie Mars. And she was kind of pretty early in her career, and she lived in a house with a bunch of other performers. Mm-hmm. And she just invited me like, oh, come to Vegas sometime. And I always call it like my midlife crisis year, because I was like, yeah, sure, I'll go to Vegas. I ended up going out there and staying with them for a week and just making friends with all the girls in the house. And and I just kind of fell into that. And I'd done a lot of porn comics, so I was always kind of comfortable, at least like presenting that part of my work to mm-hmm. people. And then Vegas just became a place where I would return every once in a while for just to visit people and hang out. And I became friends through social media with a kind of another end of that scene, with this company called Wood Rocket they don't do them anymore, but they did porn parodies. And so the head of Wood Rocket, Leroy Myers, flew me out to one of the AVN porn conventions at one point, and we hung out and got along really well, and ended up writing a John Wick porn parody together that was kind of my introduction to working on it. And then I would fly back to Vegas and work with him on his movies, and then see the hang out with my other performer friends while I was out there. And, the trans scene and the porn parody scene were like there's a lot of kind of, little bubbles of porn that don't really interact. So I kind of introduced those groups of people to each other, and that was interesting and worked out well. So yeah, that's kind of how it started. And then like during the pandemic, I was, I just recently started dating my current girlfriend, Casey, and Portland was really locked down where we were living. So we started just like driving to Vegas to hang out with our friend group. And, and just kind of ended up trying out moving there, and it worked out really well. And now my current plan is to buy a house in Vegas.
Oh, really? That's fascinating. I didn't realize that you were that kind of nested there or settled there. I've only been to Vegas twice, and it was inspiring in some odd ways. But I imagine you're not like in the center of Vegas, right?
Yeah, I don't really go to the Strip that often. And it took me a long time to I used to really dislike it. Like I'd go there for work and I'd get nosebleeds because it's so dry. And I remember having a hard time finding food I liked and things like that. And it's just one of those things where after, I think it took me about 6 months of living there until I finally figured out, I broke the code on what it is about Vegas. And I also feel like, I mean, certainly living in the Pacific Northwest for a while, I feel like America's in a weird place, and it was nice to go to a place where it felt really like it wasn't kind of playing the game that the rest of the country is playing.
You mean like politically?
Yeah, it was really. So
I guess like Vegas is like some liminal space where that's not even it's like nobody's there to talk about politics, I assume.
Yeah, I remember going into my local cafe, and the one behind the counter was wearing like a Blue Lives Matter shirt, and I was like, that's like wearing in Portland, that'd be like showing up to work in like a Klan hood, like it just wouldn't fly. And so it was just, and it was fascinating just to be able to engage with more types of people than I was used to dealing with in the Northwest.
Yeah, that's always refreshing, honestly. You forget the variety of human complexity, basically. When you go to like transplant cities and you're all 25 and believe the exact same ideologies. Yeah,
totally. I think it's really important to humanize people who think differently than you too, and it's really been cool to get to know. And Vegas is such a, like, normal people don't go there, don't live there, so it's a cool place to. Like it's interesting. Even like right now, I'm in Los Angeles and I'm just spending a year here, and it's funny how much kind of more conservative LA is as a city.
How do you mean that? Just because that word has such baggage? Oh, sure. I just mean like
I've been kind of trying to unpack it because people in LA, like there's a lot of really cool things about the city, but people in LA they seem really concerned with how other people think about them.
Sure.
Where Vegas, there's a feeling of like they're used to weirdos there. And, if somebody like is in a full cowboy outfit, they get treated the same way as if somebody showed up to a bar dressed in like unicorn pajamas. It's like they're used to it being a party city.
Yeah. That makes sense. It's like a Star Wars cantina scene. It's just like full on. Yeah. I imagine it's almost mundane, these kind of expressions.
Yeah, but I also think it doesn't get as like, in a lot of ways, it doesn't get as dark as a bigger city. Like I feel like in any major city, there's going to be like there's going to be kind of like rougher parts of it that get grimier and worse, where Vegas essentially has this small town. It's like a small town that somebody has attached this like giant tourist strip to.
Right.
Yeah. And the comic book scene there is really cool. There's like 14 different comic stores, and there's this great one called Alternate Reality that was like kind of my church I would go to every week, and I would meet there with a bunch of other comic people.
Nice.
Yeah, there's only like 3 people that actually draw comics professionally that I know there. Like like J.H. Williams, I would meet at the comic store every week. And it was great just to like pick his brain about stuff while, finding all Ninja Turtles comics and everything.
Yeah. I think that's what also makes the diary fascinating is it's just an odd location. And that adds intrigue to the whole thing.
Yeah. I think there's something about kind of figuring it out too. Cause I was in Canada for a decade.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Kind of from 30 to 40.
And then you speak of a midlife crisis. Is there a particular catalyst for that, or you just turn a certain age and it becomes an issue, whatever's going on?
Oh, when I was 40, I just and I was going through a divorce and kind of rethinking my life, and I was kind of being a little messy in the comic community and dealing with a lot of dumb politics and getting the internet mad at me and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, and just like sometimes you do things where I look back and like I joke with my friends, like my friend Natalie I mentioned, I always joke with her that I got in before, like I got into her friend group before she kind of had to close the door because she got too famous and couldn't just have weirdos show up at her front door.
Yeah, that is unfortunate. It can happen in many different ways, I think.
Yeah, certainly.
So I'm just trying to understand but comics throughout this whole thing are the bedrock from a young age, I assume. Yeah.
My parents both read comics, and so I kind of grew up with it as kind of my main focus. And yeah, it's a weird thing. I think I've talked a lot about how kind of I decided it was my plan for my life kind of before I'd really thought things through. So, by the time I think when I was 7, I announced to my mom that I was going to draw comics for a living. And I think I was in my 30s before I was like, maybe that's not a decision that I should have made at 7,
Well, I think that's a blessing in some ways, right? Because would you prefer, I don't think everyone has a calling per se, but to me, that sounds kind of horrifying. But at 7, making a decision like that, that's kind of cool. I feel like that's at least you have something that's grounded and axiomatic to get you through the difficult aspects of life.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? Because it's great to have a focus and everything, but sometimes, especially in my like teenage years, I was so focused that I feel like I kind of missed out on things.
Sure.
It's like, and that's been a big thing about kind of being in my 40s now, is realizing like it's very important to, and maybe part of the diary thing is like, it's like, if you're going to tell stories, you got to experience a life.
Oh yeah. That's a big thing that one day I realized, like, why would I care about, I mean, this may be overly simplistic, but why would I really care about a painting made by a 25-year-old?
Yeah.
It's just ultimately, what are we, besides like stylistic and technical proficiency, this isn't what it's about. And what could have, I mean, some people have very intense lives before 25, but I'm saying like they go the academic route. For me, like my life at 25, I don't know what I possibly could have communicated.
There's an enthusiasm to young art that I sometimes really connect with, but it's interesting. I mostly like the music. Like I remember thinking at some point I have a hard time listening to a rapper that's younger than me. That's shifted. There's a good Vegas guy named Easy Mill whose stuff I like a lot, but yeah, that is it, because it is kind of where you're getting. There's a kind of advice thing you're almost getting from the art that you take in.
Well, certainly if it's propaganda, then I'm very turned off. If it's, I mean, maybe if you're 50, I can entertain the idea of being told what to do via art, but
sure.
At any, college is so funny because it is so not grounded in a reality, at least a fine arts program often. And when you really step back from it, it can be quite confusing why anyone is making the work or what everyone's trying to get at with the work. But I feel like it takes people to like 30, if they're consistently working, for something of substance to emerge.
it's interesting. It's interesting talking to younger artists too, because oftentimes they'll, like there's an aggression that kind of slowly bleeds out of you as you get older. Something I think about is interesting is the idea of like people that latch on to ideas without experience is often really fascinating. I was talking to someone recently and they brought up there's a kind of famous I think it's like a Black feminist quote that gets thrown around that's like the tools, it's like you can never dismantle the master's house by using the tools of the master or something like that.
Yeah, I've heard
that one's really fascinating because it's just a bad analogy, I think, and people say it a lot, and I'm like, you can totally take down a house with a hammer and saw that built it. So why it doesn't work at all? Like on that simple level, it doesn't work. So why? So it's a bad analogy, but it sounds great.
I think, is it trying to say there's an Einstein quote? I believe is him. It could, who knows with the internet, the way quotes are attributed, but sure. Something like no problem can be solved at the level of consciousness it was created at. Like if you don't climb the rungs of consciousness, you can't possibly resolve. Like you can't solve. It's kind of like, my brother hit me, so I hit him back. Like this kind of pettiness will never transcend the initial problem.
Yeah, but I guess you can accidentally solve problems too, right? Like it could be a fire that you took a long time to build and cultivate and create, and then someone can just like, be like, oh, we got a fire we got to deal with, and somebody like, kick some sand on it, and that's the end of it.
Accident? Yeah, never considered accidentally solving a problem.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, it's. I don't know if it would be accidental in that sense.
Sure.
But you were mentioning this because, and there's an interesting idea there about. I think maybe you were talking about artists kind of naively latching onto something, but their energy propelling them through to somewhere good or bad.
Either way, right? A lot of that's subjective, but yeah. I think it's interesting to me to look back on a lot of things that are really that felt really important to me when I was younger, because I decided that they are important, and then you experience life, and just it's probably why oftentimes young people and old people don't get along is like experience sometimes really changes your view of a belief that can sound great in your mind when you're younger, and then you engage with humans and life and everything, and then you become old and jaded, or just I guess jaded and wise can sound pretty similar to me at this point. Yeah, but, I think it's really important to not like. I try to work really hard not to become a sour person. But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I have a little sister who's in her mid-20s, and we kind of butt heads a lot about ideas, and it's interesting to kind of like when it's someone you really care about, to kind of compare experiences and have a different view of the same thing.
Oh yeah. It is truly just a lack of appreciation of the other. And although we trot out kind of worn out notions of tolerance and diversity, et cetera, I truly believe those people often state these things have zero tolerance for the capital O other.
Sure. Yeah.
And you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that we're kind of like, people are kind of tribal in their monkey brains, and it's kind of our default setting we go back to. And it's something I try to fight a lot. It's not kind of, not like kind of tribalism is a big enemy of my kind of current ideology, is like trying not to see people as the enemy, as groups. Like you can an individual can suck and that's their fault, but not because they're just part of a group,
Yes. Although there is a part of your diary, which I think in some sense refutes it, as I understood it, at least, that I think you're imploring people to grapple with, or at least give some credence to your own complexity. if that makes sense. Like, I understand like groups are complex, right? And they're not monoliths, etc. But it isn't clear that individuals are either, or individuals are a thing, one thing. And
yeah, people are complicated.
so it's like, it's ultimately, I mean, I've always liked the Christian idea that if you judge, you will be judged basically tenfold, because it almost is like a computational thing for me. You couldn't possibly have the information to really truly judge someone and condemn them.
Yeah, certainly. And something, it's an interesting idea that I'm working on a science fiction comic, this Moonray thing. It's kind of my day job right now. And one of the things I'm kind of exploring in that is this idea of kind of humanity, like the idea that if reincarnation exists and we're all kind of one being, kind of like part of one, one system, and the idea that at some point, if you were to experience the life of every person around you, how you would view it differently.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an idea that hopefully gets me to kind of have some compassion for everyone around you. It's like, if you experience the life that a stranger had, then you would act like them.
Yeah.
If you're given all the tools and had their brain and everything.
So this is a book you're currently working on?
Yeah. The first two, it's a, my current, like, kind of, I call it my 9 to 5, but it's just like there's a video game company that's putting out this video game called Moonray that's in production right now. And they hired me to kind of build out the lore for the video game. So I draw a comic book to kind of flesh out the whole world for it. And then my friend Shosho Penelta is working on a kind of a side comic that I'm kind of co-writing with him. And Farrell Dalrymple did a bunch of design work for it too. So it's this.
That's a nice. You got a nice diet of work, between the porn scripts. This sounds fascinating. It sounds like in a way that, I assume you live off this, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't financially work in porn stuff, and that's been an interesting thing, is trying to like parse out like what is my like I didn't want to get too sucked into that scene. Mm-hmm. There was some point where I was at a party and I was like, there's two kinds of dudes here. There's like the the young himbo dudes, and then there's the creepy old guys. And I was like, I don't like which category I fit into that, So,
well, what's a himbo?
Oh, just like a male performer in.
Male bimbo?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Got you.
And there's some, like I said, there's some delightful people in that scene, but yeah. So I think I was just kind of getting off track talking about how, just like being involved in that community, but also not like having control over it and not feeling like, like a friend of mine texted me a bunch of the infighting and drama going on in that scene, and I was kind of nicely just like, not my horse, not my race,
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's an endless game.
Yeah,
play.
Yeah.
So this Moonray thing, is it an original story by you that you're allowed to flesh out as you see fit, or are there kind of boundaries associated with the video game itself?
I mean, the video game was already, they started making it by the time I came on. And so there was kind of there was a trailer for it initially, and kind of a bunch of kind of placeholder lore ideas. And I mean, I'm almost done 300 pages of it now. So it's interesting. The basic idea of it is it's kind of post-human, and basically humanity evolved into transporting their minds into these other bodies that could live in any environment, made out of this kind of clay material called mium. And they made these like star bodies where they could, become like 50-foot gods that flew around in space. And then eventually there's a big war, and those bodies were all killed, but the material was so strong that it retained the kind of souls, the personalities of the the beings that were in it before. And so even if it's killed and turned into liquid, they would grow again into kind of people that were like, reflections of humanity that didn't kind of remember where they came from. So there's this whole culture of them built up on this planet, and they can still die, but then they grow into new bodies. And so it's about a bunch of characters that are on this alien planet, and they're kind of trying to figure out who they are.
Okay. I think I follow that.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of my ideas just kind of go back to basic science fiction. Like the game right now is like an arena fighting thing. So there's like an element of that in the comic, but a lot of it is, I think a lot of what makes comics interesting is drawing things that feel tactile, like kind of moment to moment action. Like Scott McCloud talks about all the different types of storytelling in his Understanding Comics. And one of them is like seeing an apple on a tree, reaching out and picking it. And I feel like that is a really fun thing to read, like that, just action to action to action, where a lot of comics, like a Prince Valiant comic, will just be like, he's already holding an apple and there's a wall of text explaining that he picked it, and I feel like that's much less fun and feels like you're there less. So I try to break down a lot, like what's valuable when I'm reading a comic. I really love Richie Rich comics, and it's one of those things that on the surface, I feel like it makes me look like a crazy person, but then I really try to break down why are these so entertaining to me and why are they so fun? And when I was younger, some of my early work is much jokier, and I would try to put here's a bunch of puns on every page, so the reader's getting a value out of the page, and I would hide little jokes and do little word games and things like that. And I think that a lot of ways, I'm putting in more work than the reader really has interest in untangling. Mm-hmm. And sometimes a really enjoyable read can just be something much simpler. It's like the difference between getting a meal where somebody's like, we've given you 15 sauces and put them all on this thing, and hopefully you like it because it's got so much going on, and coupled with the idea of just something simple and clean and enjoyable.
Yeah, I've never read a single page of Richie Rich, so I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, it's kind of they're less. When I was a kid, they were everywhere.
He's rich, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the thing. Well, I always think of probably going farther back, but when I was a kid, there was Richie Rich and Scrooge McDuck were these millionaire,
right,
cartoon characters sold to kids, and I think the reason that they were the value in that is the endless resources. So it could be I think for a 10-year-old reading a comic and being like, oh, we have to go to Antarctica. Let's go there in a gold jet. It's the most extravagant way you can get there is fun.
Yeah, that makes sense. And they can the novelty is off the charts.
Yeah, and
people can do anything.
Totally. The weird, something with both makes and breaks stories for me sometimes is when things don't make sense. In Richie Rich, when his room is messy, it'll just be covered with paper money everywhere, and he just has to. And I don't think there's any thought put into why is his room covered in money? Was he just rolling around in cash like a pig?
Yeah, I like the idea that almost his detritus would also be money. Everything is money.
Yeah,
even the dust or his skin or something.
Right, totally.
It's all money.
Bed full of money again because it just grew off of me like tree leaves.
You don't have and again, pardon my ignorance in terms of what you've made, but you don't have a character, right? Like a Richie Rich or a central individual that you've made a lot of work about?
I've got a couple. I guess, I've done, it's interesting because I think I have 10 or 15 books now. And so there's things I've done, King City was kind of my breakout thing. Mm. And that's about a guy that uses a cat as a weapon. He's a thief. He has a bag of syringes, and each one he injects the cat with, it gives it a different power.
That's cool.
And that was kind of my mainstay for a while. But I kind of left it where it was because I finished that one in my early 30s, and I felt like it was kind of me really processing what it was like to be then. And I felt like if I kept going back to it, it might kind of lessen the work. And I have a thing called Multiple Warheads, which is about a woman who smuggles magical organs, and her boyfriend's a werewolf because she sewed a wolf's penis to him. Started out as a porn comic, and then so it's them going on a road trip, and I've done 2 volumes of that. So, and the main character in that's named Sexica.
So this porn thing is a through line in some sense, or erotica in some sense. Sure.
I mean, in the early days, like that was, it's kind of, it does make me feel old how much comics have changed. But like in the late 90s, that was a real moneymaker for comics. And it was much easier to get work doing porn comics than doing kind of mainstream comics in any way. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of, so it's kind of a mixed bag because I was like, I remember I moved to New York in my early 20s, and I was working like, I worked at the Strand bookstore, just like unloading crates of books out of trucks and things like that. And I realized while I was doing that, that I could make a living doing porn comics, and it was so much more appealing, the idea of drawing comic books to pay my rent than having to do like physical labor.
Sure, it's got action, and it's good for life drawing.
Yeah, I mean it's hard. I mean that's the good part about it, is it's like drawing human bodies interacting in any way is like the hardest thing to draw, I think.
For sure.
Or can be. I mean, there's lots of people always talk about zebras going up spiral staircases, being the hardest thing you can draw. But I feel like a lot of it is style. Like if you draw like Jason or something, then it's much easier to do a complicated thing in a simple style. If you're Charles Schultz, drawing a zebra going up a spiral staircase probably isn't as hard as if you're Jeff Darrow. For sure. But yeah, it was so. Yeah, I mean, a lot of that, I feel like I was kind of open to it, so I took the work, and then I remember being like 23, and one of my first comics was this publisher called Radio Comics. It was kind of an offshoot of Antarctic Press at Ninja High School and all that stuff. And they said, do a 15-page porn comic to kind of test out, and we'll run it in our anthology. And I remember being really annoyed, being like, I want to be a serious artist. I don't want to draw porn comics. And I think it's one of those things that I just did it enough that it kind of became one of part of my identity, for good or bad.
Right.
And I've always been really fascinated by the idea that a series of lines can be, like if you have a piece of paper and a stick to make a mark on it, that there's marks you can make on that paper that are like illicit and that people will get in trouble for having, or, that's a really fascinating idea to me because it feels really abstract.
Yeah. I mean, it's miraculous, basically. That's even in, I mean, images are generally miraculous, but that you could go to jail for drawing a thing or be killed or, it's just an arrangement. If you're like a materialist, it's an arrangement of color and lines forming an imaginary circumstance. It's very strange.
Yeah. And so it is kind of like magic, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, there's simpler versions of, like, even just showing depth it feels like a kind of magic, like that. You can take a piece of paper and draw a 1-point perspective, and people can feel like, oh, that blimp in the background is really far away. It's like you've kind of convinced, you've done kind of like a magic eye trick almost. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, when I was like stubborn in art school foundation year, I kind of didn't want to see, for whatever reason, the enormous potential of those fundamentals. Didn't do me any good. I don't know why I was resisting, but yeah, perspective or things of this nature that were once groundbreaking should not be taken for granted.
Yeah. But I think I understand the pushback, because I think there's it's kind of annoying the way that's presented at younger people too. Like people can be like, like you have to, you like, I remember being really frustrated by the idea of, like kind of all the hoops that I had to jump through to kind of get where I wanted was really frustrating to me. And it felt really like unnecessary in a lot of ways. And a lot of it is like when you're young, like, everyone believes they're a genius. And so it's, or hopefully you believe you're a genius if you're young, cause it doesn't get easier, and I think that kind of, the idea of someone being like, I know you're telling someone who thinks that they're going to change the world with their art that like, this is good, but you need to do this boring, difficult studying part to get there. And yeah. And so you want to reject that. And oftentimes it's kind of almost like told to people in a kind of a scolding way.
Yeah, this is fair. I think for me also, I wanted more psychological spaces. And at that time, I thought perspective was too grounded in visual reality, but that's a very, very stupid way of thinking because those are not mutually exclusive at all. There's ways to use perspective that can be beyond that for sure.
Yeah. Do you think you would argue with yourself if you ran into your art school younger self now?
Oh yeah. And I say that with great pride.
Yeah. That's an interesting idea. And an interesting thing in putting out work too, because especially if you're publishing something and you put out like, 10,000 copies of something and people have that idea of you and then you go on with your life and you change your ideology in some ways.
Yeah. I mean, I would argue with great fervor on both sides and think I was right in both circumstances. I think, and I think that's the correct way to be. I think you can get so, contrary to some things I said earlier, I think you can get so open at times and so understanding of the opposite point that you kind of dilute your current, how would I say this, blind spots. Like I think there's advantages to, and there's poetry to certain forms of ignorance. And I don't know why, but I think about this so I used to bike a lot, like bicycle.
Sure.
And I would be frustrated with how cars drove in relation to how I biked. Like they wouldn't be very considerate or aware.
Yeah.
And I kind of made the stupid assumption people make that like, if I was driving that car, I wouldn't do X, Y, or Z. Or if I'm even crossing the street at a crosswalk as a walker. But then I drive now and I don't bike very much. And I don't know how to word this, but when you drive, you're a driver, and when you bike, you're a biker. And there's tensions and dynamics that should be preserved in almost a poetic sense, and frustrations as well. And trying to like think about the biker while you're driving, you lose some of the I don't know, the drivingness of being a driver. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but that's how I think.
I think that goes back to kind of what I was talking before about the idea of being reincarnated into every person around you eventually. It's like you experience a kind of minor version of like the biker life and then seeing what it was like from the driver point of view and being like, oh, I'd act exactly like those people.
Yeah, and that sounds like, it sounds fatalistic in some ways, but I don't think it is. For me, I like categorical integrity in a sense. Like I really don't care if someone disagrees with me ideologically, politically, spiritually, etc. I just want them to be honest and have integrity. In fact, I enjoy that. But what I don't like is deception and duplicity and hypocrisy. And
but I imagine most people that are deceptive and like I feel like everyone kind of thinks they're doing the right thing oftentimes, or at least they believe they have to do what they're doing to get to their ends, which I suppose that's not a pleasant type of person you want to be around, obviously.
If their ends were their own ends, I would respect that as well. But I often find that people's ends are obscured and they're being used kind of mysteriously by forces outside their control. That may be everyone.
Yeah. No, I think that we do, just as humans, we do a lot that is not in our best interest because we have some kind of, it feels like some hidden strings pulling us, but it's just all of our weird psychological mess just telling us to do something.
Yeah, it's I mean, I believe in willpower, but modernity has inspired a certain degree of the level to which we think we control our lives is an illusion. And some of us are lucky enough to get by decade after decade for a bit, saying like, oh, I want to be this thing, and then I became it because I went to school for it and nothing got in the way.
Sure.
But then the beauty and inevitability of whatever you want to call it, you can call it life abstractly, steps in and gives you a much more interesting life, I find.
Yeah. And I think that's good. I think it would really, I think about this with my own life a lot. It's just like, if things went the way I wanted, it would, you don't appreciate things, if you just you're like, my plan is to go from A to B to C, and then there's no hiccups, and you're like, everything is fine, Yeah,
it's insane. No one would want that.
Yeah. And I think that it's just I think sometimes that hardships make you, sometimes even if you deal with them correctly, can make you a better person for other people to be around, which I think is a good goal.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I feel like sometimes when I was at what felt like some of the higher points of my life, I was probably not being the best version of myself, and that's an interesting thing to kind of contend with.
Well, that makes sense because you're not humbled in a way. You're hitting a streak after streak of what appears to be control, and that can give you a God complex where you're saying, okay, so the next thing up that I can manipulate is X, Y, or Z, and I don't think that tends to make for a good human usually. Yeah,
exactly. And it's kind of a interesting idea too, the idea of wanting to because you want to enjoy your life, but you want to be kind of self-aware enough to not use that as an excuse to treat other people poorly.
Yeah, as an excuse.
Or just kind of not thinking, there's a thing I think about a lot. There's a comic artist that I'm friendly with who told me a story about meeting me at a convention once, and I was just kind of overwhelmed with stuff. There was too much going on. I was getting too much attention. And he came up to me and was like, how much to buy your original art? And I think I said oh, it's a lot, and just walked away. And for him, he was just like, what an asshole. And for me, I was like, I can't deal with more people. I need to, I need to get out of here. And I feel like being an artist puts you in a really weird position, because it's to develop the skills, you need to get really comfortable being alone and, with silence and figuring things out. And then if you're good at it, then you're expected to get up on a stage and talk to people about it, which is kind of the opposite of that. Obviously there's art that are just getting up on stage and talking to people, but certainly for comic books and a lot of visual art, it's counterintuitive. And so, it's interesting now because I'm much more kind of cloistered off than I was in the past, but it's, and there's the weird thing of you put out books and you don't know how people feel about them or react to them. But I think kind of with the nature of the internet now, I had periods where I would have Google alerts where if anyone mentioned me online, I would immediately get it and read every article about me and everything. And I think it's really good that I was broken of that eventually, because it's almost not good to be a fly on a wall of everyone's conversation about you.
Oh, I don't think it is in any way. I mean, people you respect, of course, but I used to mimic, or you can act like, oh, I don't give a shit about what anyone thinks. And I think that saying is often at its best really saying, I don't care what, like if I don't respect someone, then I don't care what they think. But obviously it's healthy to have peers that, you know, if they say your book is bad, that you have to take it seriously and deal with that.
Yeah. Something that helped me a lot is the idea of like I don't take artistic advice from people that don't do things that I want to do.
Artistically.
Yeah, artistically. I mean, life is a whole other thing. Like, but I mean, life too. I mean, if somebody is like, you know, if somebody is not acting in a way that you want to get to, it doesn't help you to follow their advice.
Yeah, of course. And having like a salad of advice from people of all different backgrounds is not a helpful thing either.
And that's a weird social media thing, is you can have like strangers with opinions on, you know, strangers with opinions on your work, and it can stick in your head sometimes. So I think in some ways, like that's almost worth walling yourself off from.
Yeah. Can you somehow distill for me the highest point of fame you reached, like, and what that felt like, and how relevant you were? What's a good metric for understanding this?
I mean, it's funny because, you know, comic artists are always comic artists, and, you know, every person is such a tiny percentage of us are going to be like Mobius or Stan Lee or Robert Crumb or something, as far as, but for me, it's like, I mean, I had a point where, I think it was the same year. This was probably like a decade ago now, where like, I remember doing a talk at the Sydney Opera House. I did a tour where I went to Italy and got to hang out with Milo Manara, which is a really big deal for me. And then I went to Australia and Matt Groening, the Simpsons guy, doing a talk along with, then I got to do a talk at the Opera House in Sydney. And like, that was right. I was working for Kanye West around that time, and he used to call me up sometimes.
Doing what?
That was an interesting story. It was a weird job. So like, I'll tell you the long version if you want, but basically the gist of it is kind of odd jobs for a while. Like, he was working on 2 different movies that never happened. One was a live action adaptation of the Jetsons. And the other one was this thing called Boy, which I just found. I did a interview recently with the author Bret Easton Ellis, who did American Psycho. That was my big LA experience, is going over to his house and talking to him about movies and whatnot on his podcast. But I'd found out he had written he used to go to Calabasas and, you know, hang out with Kanye West and that crew and everything. And he had written the script that I was then kind of reworking ideas for him. And he told a great story where, like, there's all these really fun, weird ideas in it that I didn't know where they were coming from, because it was such a weird game of telephone. But in the script for that, they use llamas as money, and one of the characters becomes like a llama centaur. And Brett told this great story where they were all at like Calabasas, sitting around, you know, sipping their golden champagne or whatever, all sitting on chairs made out of Richie Rich's skin or something. And this was, you know, years ago, so the CGI wasn't where they wanted it to be. And one of the guys was telling Kanye West that that they don't know if they could have the llamas in it. They should think of something else, because the llamas are going to look weird, because fur is hard to do in computers. And apparently he had kind of a screaming thing where he's like, I only got into this to make the fucking llamas. But yeah, so that was kind of my. Yeah. So
all right. So you reached Kanye level.
Yeah. But
and then you reached Sydney Opera House.
Yeah.
And was this all the same time period?
Yeah, that was all at the same time.
And so, what propelled you to that specifically? Was there one book?
I mean, I think at that point it was. Prophet got a lot of attention. So Rob Liefeld, you know, the guy who created Deadpool and Youngblood and all that stuff. At one point, I got hired to kind of rework his series Prophet, which is kind of like a Captain America analog. And I set it like 10,000 years in the future and made kind of Prophet a series of, like, basically humanity was gone, but Prophet had been cloned into an army, and there was now just like millions of copies of this one person that were all kind of warring with themselves and trying to take over the universe. And I did that with a group of other artists. Like I was mostly writing that. It was the first time I'd kind of collaborated with other people. And I was writing it with my friends Farrell Dalrymple and Simon Roy and Yanni Melodionis and a bunch of other guys all doing art on it. And that got a lot of attention. And we did that for like, it came out in 5 collected volumes. So I did it for like 5 years. That was a really fun project. We all got matching tattoos at the end of it. Like my left arm has got a big Prophet eye on it now.
Okay, so coming off of that, is it fair to say you peaked in terms of just social status?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I was kind of, I guess I got to experience for a minute what it was like to be kind of a comic book darling, and I was in all the issues of America's Best Comics, and I felt like I was kind of straddling a line at that point between doing mainstream comics and doing kind of indie comics. And I had friends that were always like pushing me to be like, do your next book with Picture Box. It's like a little, like a small, yeah. And so I did like a sketchbook through them. And then I was like, it was interesting because I was really anti Marvel and DC at that point, which is kind of a thing I've softened much more on. Like I've got a friend of mine who's doing this book called Nights at Image. This guy Wyatt Kennedy, and I kind of sometimes I kind of coach him through his career, and he's started getting Marvel work, and it's funny because I was very adamant about never taking it, and talking to him now, I'm just like, yeah, I mean, you're going to reach a whole new audience. Something weird about that thing is they change your work without asking you, which is always
how so.
I mean, Wyatt's kind of a mild example, but like I knew a writer years ago who did a DC book, and he turned in the script and it was being drawn. And then when the book came out, they totally reworked the last page, had it redrawn and rewritten, and his name was on it. And he was like, I had no say in this.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah. So I think that thing happens a lot because they view it as like, the couple jobs I did a couple jobs for DC, and I remember, like they had in-house production at that point. And so they would like, I drew like they used to have these things called the Big Books of Wild Women, or it was what the book that I wrote. They had these thing called the Big Books through like a Paradox Press, I think, which is kind of a side like Vertigo style imprint of DC. And I did this story about a woman who had these giant balloons that would do this dance on stage with them. And the editor, I didn't draw the balloons perfect circles because, balloons don't look like that generally. And the editor, I remember sent it off to have the balloons made into perfect circles. And then when she got it back, she was like, oh, that was a bad idea. We messed up your originals.
It's just control for control's sake at that point.
Yeah. But I think that's like, we talked before about kind of the culture of comics. I think that's kind of mainstream comics culture. I had a friend that was putting out a zine in Japan, and he hired a Marvel artist to do some work with it. And the Marvel artist just changed his art. And my friend was like, fuck this guy. But that guy was like, this is how we do it. Like it's about getting the best thing made, and it's not about the auteur's vision. So a lot of it is just like totally different ways of looking at comics as like a commercial product that's all under this umbrella of like the company controls Batman versus if you're doing personal work, and like it's unthinkable for, nobody's going to take a Mobius drawing and be like, oh, before this goes to print, let's rework this eye. I mean, that's famously like why Jack Kirby left Marvel, is when they're having like his Hulk drawings redrawn by someone else, like the faces fixed on characters he created.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Kirby was, I mean, that's always kind of a go-to with comic book people, is like, you look at Jack Kirby and Alan Moore, and if you kind of study their careers, they were treated really poorly. And,
yes.
And that's the thing that gets said a lot to younger cartoonists, is like, they're not going to treat you better than Moore and Kirby,
Right.
But I think there's ways to kind of build your own way to get about things. Like lately, I'm doing a lot more books with a smaller publisher lately, Living the Line, the guys who are publishing my diary book.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been a really cool experience, kind of being much more like, I really like Image, and I'm gonna do more books with them and everything. I think they're a great publisher to work out of, but they do so many books that you get kind of lost in the ocean of it sometimes. And so I've been really enjoying working with Sean, the publisher, Living the Line, just because it's like, it feels much more like ground floor, and we'll kind of workshop ideas through and talk about, it's like he puts out 4 books a year, so we get like much more attention on each book, and that's been a really cool experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'm trying to understand, I'm assuming you started off with much more of an alternative comics trajectory when you were younger.
Yeah, I was really into Antarctic Press that do like kind of Texas manga when I was younger.
I don't know that.
So you're familiar with like Ninja High School?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Ninja High School was started by Ben Dunn, who started this company called Antarctic Press, and they did Ninja High School and Gold Digger by Fred Perry, which is like about a female Indiana Jones and her were cheetah sister. And it's all kind of people in Texas making their kind of takes on manga. And I was really into that stuff. And that's the first company that published me. Yeah, and I think a lot of it is I really grew up on being really obsessed with a lot of French and Japanese comics. And so I didn't really have a clear trajectory. Like I often feel like I'm, like I feel like there's very clear, like it's shifted a bit, but I feel like there's really clear spots in comics. Like you have Fantagraphics, indie comics, and you have, Marvel and DC comics are kind of like the 2-party system. And now there's more. You can, there's, like a Boom book looks different than either of those, but I did really feel like I didn't kind of fit in either of those very cleanly, because I really liked the idea. And a lot of it is I had these very young ideas of kind of what the reality of comics would be like versus versus what it's actually like to work in comics.
Sure. Yeah. What else could you have, I suppose?
Yeah. So yeah, so I went through a long period of kind of trying to figure out how I fit. And a lot of that's what they do in the adult comics came in just to live off of it. And then King City was kind of my breakout book, because I was doing it for this kind of American manga company called Tokyo Pop. My friend Becky Clunan was doing a book there, and she introduced me to him. And it was the first time that like that was the big moment where I was like, could actually live off of comics full time and didn't have to do a bunch of side jobs. Yeah, so I don't think I had a very clear trajectory for like the type of American comics I did. I think it was like I basically wanted to do like weird French manga. I started calling it world comics in recent years. We're kind of, and that's another interesting topic too. It's where you can take like there's big art movements where like Air Gay was really influenced by Japanese Japanese woodblock prints at the time that influenced how he colored books. And then you look at like how Mobius was really influenced by Robert Crumb. And there's these kind of like back and forth. And a lot of my favorite manga artists have a lot of Mobius in them. So this kind of cross-pollination between different cultures is really interesting, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I didn't realize that till later in my life that Van Gogh is essentially a guy who saw some woodblock prints and then painted them in oil.
Yeah, totally.
And that becomes so obvious. And when you make that connection, the way he handles his paintings, and that's not to discredit him at all. It's just, I think when you're young, although I believe in like an original divine spark that actual artists have, real artists never deny their influences. But really shitty ones, like I used to run a gallery, and people who, whatever, they work next door at, any business unrelated to art, and they fancied themselves artists on the side, and they would bring me stuff to look at, and I would be honest with them. And what I found most shocking is the thing that not real artists always say when you ask them if they have any influences is that they have none. They just simply say, no, I have no influences. This is just me. This is just the original me right here. But meanwhile, real artists are happy to tell you, very clearly this is the trajectory of their influences over time, and this is who they're indebted to.
Yeah, because I think at the core, the idea is that you take these things and it gets changed by your own life experience. So even though Van Gogh's looking at woodblock prints and reworking it, it's like you get this very Van Gogh version of them.
Yeah, and that's unavoidable. He couldn't make Japanese woodblock prints if he wanted to.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. Do you know Matt Howarth's work at all?
No, Matt Howard?
Matt Howarth. He's this really fascinating, like he's kind of like, I think he's one of the most impressive cartoonists to ever do it in America. He's did a lot of stuff in the 80s. He did this series called The Post Brothers, which are about these dimension jumping criminals. And then he did a side story called Savage Henry, which was about a band in the same city. And they basically like switched to all these alternate universes and they can shift into different realities. He did a comic called Connie and Zoo, which is he made an attempt to make it with no humanoids in it. So it's aliens, and the main two characters are three floating rocks and a centipede.
That sounds great.
He's done these really cool, innovative comics. He did a time travel comic that you're meant to fold into a Mobius strip so it never ends. He did a comic with subliminals printed on the back of the page, so you hold it up to the light to see it through. He's really fascinating. But I bring him up because he talked in interviews about how he was almost too influenced by other work, and so he listened to a lot of electronic music, but he would get comics that he liked, and he'd be like, I can't even look at this right now because I'm just going to copy that, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I've talked to certain artists about, like, made recommendations for them to look at certain stuff because I thought it was, echoing what they did, and I remember one just being like, "Nah, I'm not going to look at that. It will influence me too much."
Have you had the
experience? And I thought that was goofy, kind of.
Yeah, it is. Have you had the experience though, where somebody is convinced that you would like something because it feels like your work, and then it
sure, it? Yeah.
Like that's interesting. Like there's a cartoon out now called Scavenger's Reign, and I had like a dozen people message me and be like, "It looks like your art. You got to watch it." And kind of all it did is push me away from watching it.
Yes, I was looking while you were talking to me. I was looking at some of the work. I can't remember which comic you had mentioned, but there definitely was some Scavenger's Reign vibes. So you haven't watched it?
I saw the first episode.
Yeah, I think I watched the first 3. It seems very good. I didn't connect with it.
Yeah, that was kind of my thing. I was like, good on them. But I have a weird thing with animation where it's like, if I watch modern animation, I get a little too into my head about how it's produced, which I think
that's fair.
Positive. Like I'll watch old Disney movies and I'll just be like enamored with like everything's painted. Like, I'll watch a movie from the 50s or something and I'll be like, they had to letter set the, they had to do something with the, with even the credits. To like, there's no computers involved in this, so you're probably printing those credits out on acetate and taking a photograph of them.
Oh, sure. There's Fantasia techniques that are just insane.
Yeah, so that stuff's really fascinating. But then when I watch modern animation, I just I start to think too much about it. That kind of takes me out of it in a less fun way, because I just imagine a bunch of people in Korea in cubicles,
That's fair. I mean, honestly, I can't go an episode without talking about Miyazaki, but the last Miyazaki, that was a problem for me, the way 3D was used. And it was very like in my brain and I don't know if you saw the new one, The Boy and the Heron, but I just could not reconcile with the way the 3D and the 2D were done together.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Now, on another note, I always thought it was funny that Mobius, and I talk about this a lot in this podcast because I think it's important, that Miyazaki, when he saw Mobius's work, he was somewhat disturbed by the fact that he saw it later in life when his style had already solidified.
Sure.
Because he wishes he had been able to see it earlier to integrate more of it. But I mean, Nausicaa is very, very Mobius. So I feel like he managed to deal with that. But I think that's an interesting lesson for young artists. And I'm not saying that's necessarily the right path, because I don't think everyone is trying to have one solid style per se, but I think considering that you can like things or like art without mimicking it, and that's an option, is an important type of integrity to develop before 25, probably.
Yeah, that's interesting. Mobius is a fascinating thing. I remember the artist Michael Kaluta. I used to run into him at conventions a lot in New York. He's a really fantastic illustrator, but he used to talk about Mobius as like he's an artist that teaches you how to draw by looking at his work. And I feel like there's a thing like you'll look at a Mobius page and sometimes you'll be like, oh, everything seems easier now. It makes sense. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, I mean, Mobius is difficult because it's like, if you look at his stuff, you draw a little more like him, and it can almost be like hard to get out from under, you know? Because like,
yeah, and people know and they're looking for it. They're like, oh, that's a little too Mobius right there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a weird thing to kind of like I always think about the idea of like, you want to take your influences and kind of eat them and digest them. And there's a difference between that and just like wearing them as a coat, you know?
That's fair. Yeah. It's got to go through your internal mechanisms, totally. Your system.
Yeah. I find it really fascinating, the kind of family of artists. Like you have like, you know, you have a bunch of Mobius guys, and now you have like there's a bunch of Frank Quietly guys, right? Mm-hmm. And there's like good ones and bad ones, you know, like there's people where you're like, I love this. I love this. You know, there's like Mobius, there's people that are Mobius influenced artists that are fantastic at it and take it. Like I'll butcher his name, but I just got an art book by Sylvain Dupree, who did like worked on Fifth Element and Gladiator, a bunch of movies. And I feel like he's almost a better technical artist than Mobius, but doing it in the same style.
I was just watching The Fifth Element last night.
What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I saw it when I was young, you know, and having read the Incal now, it changes the way I view the film. And having understood the fact that Mobius and Jodorowsky tried to sue Luc Besson for stealing the Incal, but Mobius worked on the production design. It's a very funny way to watch the film. I think that film is great, honestly. And I don't think I could understand how good it was when I was young.
Sure.
But there's also something fun about watching that film and being like, should they have won that lawsuit or not? Because I think in some ways they had a good point. But I also find it funny to hire someone for one thing and then to hypothetically steal the more important thing from them and then just be like, nah. Yeah,
there's a story. There's a story about, I think Disney hired Mike Mignola to work on their Atlantis movie. Excuse me. And when he showed up at the office, they'd already had a bunch of his artwork printed out on everybody's desk, and they were like had been using it for months to draw in his style.
Yeah, and then they bring him in just to be like, credit him.
Like month 4, they're like, I suppose we should hire the guy whose stuff we've been looking at all this time. So he lives down the street.
I don't even know what this film is. Is it a film?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I said the title wrong. Right? Yeah, Disney's Atlantis. Is that?
No, I look at it. I'm looking it up, and it just looks like he straight up him. But yeah, it's just Atlantis, the Lost Empire, I think.
Yeah.
Never seen it.
It looks a lot like there's a anime called Nadia, The Secret of Blue Water. It's kind of it almost is like the Disney version of that.
I don't know that one.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Kind of going back to the Mobius, Jodorowsky stuff. Like I always felt like Mobius is such a he's such like a kind of interesting creator in a way that I feel like because I really don't like Jodorowsky's comics for the most part, but I was
about to ask you that in a way, because we'll go on and then I'll ask you.
Yeah, so basically like I think that Mobius. So I think the Incal is basically like Jodorowsky looking at all of Mobius's other work and being like, let's make a story out of this. Let's actually like boil this into a longer thing, because like, you know, the Airtight Garage is so all over the place and you know, purposely all over the place and weird that it's almost like that is distilling it down. And then it's almost like the Fifth Element is like a further thing of like, let's take the Incal and make it even more presentable for the world. And, you know, and it's not to say that the Fifth Element's better than Incal at all, but yeah. And the thing I always joke about is they did a book together called Madwoman, The Sacred Heart.
Yeah.
And I always joke about like Jodorowsky managed to make the only Mobius comic I don't like.
It's not very good. I have it.
Yeah, I still have it too because it's beautifully drawn.
It's a little goofy. What's interesting for me is to think about is if, I mean, I love Jodorowsky's films, and I love Mobius, but
Sure. I
do wonder what would have happened if. I'm not always sure it's the best pairing, and I'm not sure I don't think Jodorowsky always writes the best comics, and I've never read like Meta Barons because I'm not interested in that weird, like shiny, glossy digital coloring that's often used.
Yeah, I don't recommend a lot of it's always. I feel like I shouldn't say this in public that much, but yeah, I feel like I do think that there's the Jodorowsky or that he is really like I always think about the I think it's El Topo that has like the character with no arms and character with no legs. And I always think about like he had to find those, like maybe he had the actors first and was like, let's write a story because I know a guy with no legs and I know a guy with no arms. But I feel like the difficulties of filming something in reality kind of almost was like the hammer to beat that steel into a sword, you know? And when he does a comic, it's almost like it comes too easy and he can just go so crazy with his ideas that sometimes they just don't make any sense. Like something that's always, not to sound too much like a hater, but something about him that I always kind of sticks in my craw is like, I felt like there was an arrogance in the Dune documentary about how great his Dune would be. And something that's really like a core tenet of my life is that something that's finished is always better than something that's not finished.
Sure.
And so it's like, even the flaws of David Lynch's Dune, he made it, you know, and I think that that's really valuable. Because I think like right now I'm sitting on like, I have like 4 half-finished comics. And it's really important to me. I'm like, these, even if it takes another decade, these 4 will be completed, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's the right mentality. Yeah, Jodorowsky, well, I don't know if there's all this interconnecting things. I feel like Kanye lives his life like he thinks, like in some sense that Jodorowsky is writing it, or that the way Jodorowsky thinks is the way he should live his life.
Yeah,
like that.
They've kind of gotten everything, or they've gotten to this huge cultural changing level by sheer bravado in some ways. Like there's talent in both of them, obviously, but there's a lot of.
But the way he behaves is interesting to me lately, and in general, where I think he often says Jodorowsky is his favorite artist, but it's like the way he plays with symbols in real life, Kanye, it feels like a story of Jodorowsky or something, which I think is very audacious, honestly. And I don't think most people understand it, but I have a hard time taking it seriously, like from a literal perspective.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a silly way. It's funny because it's like, I both think it's silly and he's changing the world also, you know?
Oh, it's definitely goofy.
Yeah.
And even like, what is it called? Mad what of the Sacred Woman? I can't remember the name of the book.
Madwoman of the Sacred Heart?
Madwoman of the Sacred. Yeah, like that's a very goofy, stupid book. Often with the diary, but it's not. I don't know. Jodorowsky plays around like that a lot, where it's like there's that kind of diarrhea motif, if I'm remembering correctly, which has some spiritual connotation that does make sense. But something about it is also just really stupid. It's
really unpleasant to read in a lot of ways because if I remember right, it's been a while since I read it. But it's basically like the conceit of it is there's a college professor who they're like, you're a deity. And the whole time is he's like, how can I be a deity? I got diarrhea all the time. And, it's just like self-doubting. It's like,
I believe he's like the second coming of Christ. And then they find a Mary that they kind of force him to have sex with. And then, I don't know. It's too much, I think, ultimately.
Yeah. And it's just,
the density is weird.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to, I think at the end of this conversation, we were talking a little about like, there's a cartoonist persona of like a self-deprecating self-doubt that I really have never connected with. I have a hard time with Chris Ware comics. Like I can recognize the achievement that they are, but it's like, I remember years ago, somebody, I was talking to a guy in comics, and he was really selling me hard on Chris Ware stuff. And I was like, I'm going to give it a try. And then my first thought reading it was like, I didn't get beat up enough in high school to relate to this stuff. You know, it just feels really.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way about Ware. I'm just not interested in. I can respect the. Yeah,
I mean, he's clearly an amazing draftsman. And same thing with like I feel like on all these guys, like I hopefully there's imparting a level of respect, because like Jodorowsky and Kanye West and Chris Ware are all people doing like top level craft stuff, but I think that we're able to critique their stuff because it's also interesting to see like, what do I like and what do I not like about this, you know?
Oh, it's out of love. I mean, like I said, I love Miyazaki, but that last film I'm very critical of, the way I would be critical of a friend I really respected who made work. It's just,
yeah,
it's the respect of kind of chewing on it a bit more and just thinking it through and trying to understand mechanically in some ways what works and what doesn't. But, for me, like you were saying with animation, it's just, once computers get involved, unless you are really embracing its digitalness and being overt with it, I think it's an unholy matrimony often.
Yeah, I can see that. It's something interesting about Miyazaki too is I feel like he gets, just kind of going the thread of kind of people's personalities and the work you get from them, is I feel like a lot of people have a hard time struggling with the idea of Miyazaki's public persona versus the work he makes. You know, like
sure.
Being kind of, and I feel like you only get that work if a person is like that, you know?
In what sense?
Like he's really harsh and, he's kind of a gravelly dude, but mm-hmm. I think that the reason that you get such singular, beautiful work by him is that he's really that, like he's that passionate about it. And he's kind of grumpy about things because what he's doing is actually really hard. And especially if you're working with a huge studio of people, like your intentions have to be very clear. You can't be like, everyone's doing great work, keep it up. You know, you get a horrible movie.
Of course. But he also has a beautiful humanism about him that seems to save him, from just having films fall apart. And in that sense, his paradoxical nature seems very well balanced to make great films.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that's something that, not to be curmudgeonly, but there is an overemphasis on being liked and over socialization, and it doesn't make good art. There are directors who were good to work with, good people, but it's pretty rare that great ones are. And I think because they value something transcendent over the human emotion of their crew. They're on like a warpath, on a mission at any cost to fulfill that dream or that vision, that goal. And the particular emotions of each individual crew member, I don't think really crosses their mind.
Yeah, I imagine it's a balance. I've only worked on an animated movie, so it's all a little alien to me. But yeah, I mean, essentially, on some level, you're dealing with people whose job is to extract a story out of a group of people, and because there's all these stories about like, I was just watching a dumb video on the Pirates of the Caribbean and how they were leaving things out of the script so the actors, so they could get real shock on the actor's face when this character returned or something. And so it's interesting on that element, because there's an interesting thing about illustration in comics where there's an aspect of that where it's like there's an acting aspect to how you present a story through that medium too, but it's like you're manipulating yourself rather than a whole crew of people.
Yeah, that's true. Each facet of yourself.
Yeah, and even there's, I think I'm just dragging it back because even in comics, I think there's people, like I always feel like I think Will Eisner's work's fantastic, but I feel like sometimes he overacts. Like his characters do these really grand gestures all the time.
Yeah, like a theatricality.
Yeah. Something I've been really enjoying lately is getting books on the kind of how-to books on comics, like the Will Eisner books and Scott McCloud books, and then trying to go through them and being like, what do I disagree with here? You know?
Well, what do you disagree with?
I mean, with Eisner, it's been a while since I've read it, but I actually have a PDF I'm slowly going through now. But with Eisner, he's really intent on the idea that you can't surprise readers in comics because they can just flip ahead and flip back. But
that's a weird idea.
Yeah, I do think you can surprise readers still, because I think in comics you kind of have to do it in a different way, though. Because you could do the simple way of like a page turn. And that's something interesting about the mechanism of comics, too, because like I always think about how cool it is. Like, I forget who it was. There was a cartoonist who always tried to have, he would put like doors opening on the page turn. So the reader was actually like physically turning the page when the characters were opening a door to kind of give that same tactile feeling.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that was kind of cool. Yeah, so I mean, that's one of the big Eisner ones. It's just basically like, yeah, and I think he was relating a lot because he worked in theater. He was relating a lot of comic books to like having the stage set, and something I'd always push back against is the idea of the is it called the 360 rule or the 180 rule in comics in film?
I don't know.
So basically, there's a rule of like in film. There's a rule that you think of a scene as a stage, and you have the side that the audience is on, and the side that that's like the backstage, and basically the idea is that there's kind of an axis line where you never want to go behind the characters in a single shot. You want to show the turn. So you want to, if you're going to show someone, like if you're going to kind of flip the shot and show the back of a character's head after showing the front of the character's head, you want to show their side first. So it's not like,
okay. Yeah. Sure.
And it's called the 180 rule or something, but it's a film rule, and I think it applies to film because if you immediately like change angles that dramatically, it confuses people because it's a single screen that you're looking at, and it can kind of feel like an I Dream of Jeannie, like character popping out and popping back in a weird way. But I think that something about the act of reading a comic book is you can break that rule at any point because you're not. The reader's not, it's like as long as you established a relationship between characters and a previous panel, then you can just kind of show them from absolutely any angle, and the reader can keep up much more than in film.
Yeah, I think it has more flexibility than film.
Yeah, so it's interesting, the idea of kind of what rules are specific to comics. And specific to print comics too, because obviously like web comics, you get a totally different thing. Like there's no page turn.
Right.
And something I've been thinking a lot lately is the lack of like making work for print feels less disposable than doing work online.
Yeah, I know. I've been thinking about that, especially with AI and the disposability of imagery in general. I think that's what also maybe why I'm connecting to the diary more is oftentimes you don't know what you got till it's gone, and I think humanness and the value of human expression is going to become more and more precious. And so to see a diary in the context that I've been thinking about AI and the internet in general brought me back in some way to just the mundane quality of life itself.
Yeah, like there's something pleasant about just a person trying to express something simply. Because it's interesting because AI creates work that's really, really beautiful sometimes, but it just doesn't have, like, it's almost too slick and you're not really connecting with anything real. You'd be like, look at this beautifully rendered, 3 light source picture of Naruto, but it just doesn't tell you anything about another human's experience.
Yeah. I mean, shit, who knows where it'll go? Maybe it'll be able to mimic that. But Yeah, it's time to fall in love with just materiality of life. It's funny because I'm ardently against materialism as a way of viewing life.
Sure.
But that's a completely different notion. The tactile quality of life and materials themselves, and books especially.
Yeah, but they can be kind of fleeting too. Like my friend Farrell Dalrymple is a fantastic cartoonist. He has a we lived together a couple times over the years, and at one point, at several apartments that we'd move into, he would build his own bookshelf. I saw him do it twice, where he'd just go out and get wood and just kind of saw together his own bookshelf, and then he would purge all the books he had that didn't fit on that bookshelf. And there's very few things, like he would keep like original art from friends and everything, but there's very few things that he actually like wanted to keep. And he would give me like these amazing French art books and just be like, I don't want this anymore. And that has been a big, like, I think about that a lot. Like, like every time I move, it's a really good excuse to get rid of everything. And there's a couple things like, I have all my Manara and Mobius books that I've carted around with me since I was a teenager, but it's nice, the idea that, there's also books that you kind of like, not to sound cheesy, but it's like you carry them around in yourself because it's like the stuff affects you so much. And I think that's that way with film too. It's not like you're carrying around a DVD in the same way you do a book, but it affects you so much that it kind of changes your view of the world. So I think that's a big value. And obviously I imagine that AI can get to the point that kind of manipulates humans in that, but I think there's it goes back to that idea of like, almost the magic of art is like it helps us to believe that there's another person on the other end of the string.
It helps us. I don't know what like children born in 50 years will need from that, but it's going to be fascinating to understand.
Yeah, but it's something else interesting is I with AI, it's really made me realize that even if you were to create something with AI that was that is such a better experience than engaging with art made by people, it wouldn't stop me from making it. It's like if no one reads it, you still have to. And that's kind of the diary stuff is, it's almost a surprise. Like I always kind of was like, oh, this is going to go to print, but it's kind of funny to me that it's coming out now because a lot of it is like, this isn't necessarily made for other people.
Right.
But hopefully people can, that's the cool thing is when people connect with stuff. I always think about Robert Crumb stuff, and how people are like I feel like he's a cartoonist that offends a lot of people.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I was watching, my girlfriend just had a YouTube thing on the other day, and the one on the YouTube just kind of made a point where she was like, this work reminds me of my least favorite cartoonist, Robert Crumb. I was like, why would you even bring him up? Because she was talking about like, I think she's talking about newspapers in the 1920s. And she was like, this stuff is probably the stuff that Robert Crumb grew up on and made him such a bad person. And he's kind of like held up as like there's a lot of people. There's Ben Passmore, I think is his name. He did an award speech recently where he was like publicly shitting on Robert Crumb, and it seemed really weird to me because he felt like he was really in like kind of standing on Crumb's shoulders, being like, screw that guy. But I think Crumb's biggest crime, if you kind of look at it from my point of view, is he had weird feelings about race and sex and all these things, and he put it out in his comics. Like it was like really like here's these weird ideas we're doing. And I think there's a value to that. Like, even if you're like, I don't agree with this idea I had, but I had an idea, let's process it. I think that's really interesting.
Why is that a crime?
Oh, we live in a weird era. I think people, I think the kind of moralism of the internet always like.
Okay. You're saying from that perspective.
Yeah. Yes. It's not like it's not a sane person's view that it's wrong to convey, your emotions in your art. But I think that's a weird thing of the kind of art community, especially online, is that, there's a lot of moral flagellating about like, what art is appropriate, which, I think in a positive way, it's like we're kind of we're in a dangerous time for art again, which.
Yeah. In fact, that makes me, I don't like this term, but I have thought about it recently, the term edgelord, which is often applied to Jodorowsky and probably Kanye at this point.
Oh, sure.
And I haven't really had time to process it, but what strikes me as funny is every artist I talk to repeatedly talks about the feeling that they are not at the center of anything, but always at the edge of something. And, if that's a scene or whatever, a community. And that makes sense to me. That's how I felt in my life as well. In other words, they're not the metal guy wearing all the metal shirts and having the metal hair when he walks down the street, people go, oh, that's what metal looks like. They're somehow on the edges, understanding it, but also trying to kind of redevelop it and develop it into something new. And to use a term for someone being on the edge or the fringe of something in a pejorative sense is very telling of what I view as a type of over-socialization in which people are way too overly concerned about social cohesion and acceptance, which I view as a really shitty thing to care about. I mean, the truth is one thing to care about, but to be accepted, especially as an artist, this is I don't know why, because I don't understand the cosmic dynamics that play out in this sense, but I don't think any good art has ever come from that.
Yeah, I wonder, do you think we have a healthy subculture in America right now, like counterculture?
I believe in a sense, we exist in that wilderness of mirrors where I can't tell what that counterculture is. Everything keeps countering and bouncing back to a degree that it's so flat. I don't know. We can delude ourselves into think we're countering something, but I think I was talking to Dan Adele of Picture Box, and I think we were talking about this idea of countercultural or alternative comics, and it isn't even clear what that means anymore. So I'll address it from what I view as the human perspective, what I see in human people I interact with on the daily. I don't think that something is occurring, at least to me, where people are becoming increasingly boring on average. And whatever the subterranean elements of their psyche is, it's not being accepted or expressed in a way that is healthy. So I'm comfortable saying that I think something is wrong with the darker parts of humans I encounter and their ability to express things that might not seem acceptable. But I don't feel comfortable saying that there even is a counterculture or subculture that I can identify. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, that's because it's something I've been struggling with lately, because it's like there's, I feel like certainly in the 90s when I was my brain was forming, there's a lot of, there was really like kind of like a clear counterculture to the mainstream culture. And I think that something strange that we exist in now is that there's kind of, you have kind of a lot more like lockstep ideologies and less of like a group of people that's like knows that they're not mainstream and is comfortable having ideas that go against the mainstream.
Do you think that was real or an illusion then?
I think it was real, because I think that basically you had a clear, like a lot of it for me was that corporate America in the 90s was worse at its job than it is now. Like I remember when I grew up in Seattle and grunge was, when grunge was blowing up, the kind of mainstream version, like you'd get advertisements in magazines that were just these embarrassing, like we hired a model and put him in flannel and had him grow a soul patch, and it just was like kind of missing the point of what even the visual look of it was. Mm-hmm. And I think that something happened in the decades since that kind of where I think a lot of And I think a lot of it's just that what we viewed as, like I often refer to kind of now as kind of an anti-art era. And I think that in a lot of people's minds, kind of political ideology has replaced kind of artist ideology. So, so now someone will be like, it's less about like, I'm doing something artistically risky. And now it's more of like, I'm doing something politically risky.
Sure.
Which is politically risky, but it can be like, in comics, like a lot of the dumb culture war stuff in comics, it's just literally like, here's a gay Batman and everyone will get mad about it. But it's not actually interesting from an artistic level at all.
No. I think art is really, what would you call it? Like literacy in respect to art is really difficult to develop, but it's really easy to say that Batman is gay or not.
Sure.
And I think that's what's happening in a lot of ways. It's like we're using the most uninteresting metrics to judge things because it's easy. Meanwhile, to grapple with the immensity that is a great artwork is really difficult. But if you can just write a review where it's like, this movie did not have enough, I don't know, women of color,
sure,
then you can be heard and you don't have to risk assessing something genuinely. And I think that's certainly one element. Now, maybe the reactivity of like quote unquote counterculture isn't necessarily a good thing, but
yeah, I think there can be bad sides of it too. Just being against something. Like I always feel like it makes me think of Satanism for some reason. Like I always feel like Satanism feels a little silly to me because it's such a like mad at dad at Christianity.
Well, it's obscene. I mean, no, I get into that a lot because I mean, I am Christian and I was raised Christian, and to take one of its sub characters, although an important one, and to identify with it, whether it's just goofy. Like if you're an atheist, I understand, but to play the game in an inverted sense and give it your attention, it definitely comes off as very high school to me.
Yeah, totally. So that's an interesting thing. I feel like I've talked your ear off forever here, but if you want to keep going, because I am fascinated with the idea of how faith plays into making art.
Oh yeah. I mean, I actually interviewed a devotional artist. So he makes sculptures for churches. And it was very interesting because lately I've been trying to understand the limits of self-expression. Mm-hmm. Because once you realize that, well, I really value individuals and what the Enlightenment has brought in a lot of ways.
Sure.
But I think we're definitely reaching a point where we're recognizing its limits, and some people recognize it in completely opposing political senses. But I think everyone's getting a sense that there's got to be more to just like individual pursuit of pleasure, and even within art, So to talk to him about where does self-expression fit into devotional work that isn't about him per se was very interesting, because the majority of art history is not about self-expression. There's an element of it, but they're operating within these super complex cultures that are integrated in some sense, and everyone's kind of aiming at a similar objective.
Right. Yeah. And there's a certain element of like, I guess for positive and negative, you had like such a huge history of like the church funding art.
Yeah. It's like unavoidable. And I can't even remember the initial, you were asking about.
Yeah. Well, I think there's just a lot of things about kind of a belief system in relation to art too. Like,
faith. Yeah.
Yeah. Even having a clear idea of an afterlife and the idea of like how your art might kind of, cause I do, I worry a lot about kind of the finite, and that's like, I work a lot partially to be like, I feel like life is short.
Yeah.
And it's easy to look at an artist's entire body of work and be like, oh, they did 6 books. Those are pretty good, But the idea of, having a clear idea of an afterlife and be able to kind of continue creative and experiences and everything. Like I had a thought the other day. I was just like something fascinating about being a human is just you get to experience all these crazy things. You can be like, this is what it feels like to be on a roller coaster, on a roller coaster. And this is what steak tartare tastes like and everything. And the other day I was like, I get to experience death. What a fascinating thing. Like everyone's going to do it, but you don't really think about like that's going to be a thing to deal with at a certain point.
Oh, yeah. I mean, faith is a strange, I think that word is used oddly in modern contexts.
Yeah, it can mean very different things.
Yeah, it certainly is not the absence of scientific proof as most atheists will frame it, because it's a kind of convenient way to assert your own frame while making a negation of the person already that
Sure.
you aren't talking to about a complex thing. But yeah, I was talking to him about just like there's such different modes, like excavating your own psyche day in, day out versus aiming at something transcendent and higher via a religious structure you happen to believe in. And of course, this relates to political ideology as well. Faith in your political system, making work in a sense of propaganda for that. I'm sure that feels really different too.
Yeah.
And probably gives you certain dopamine hits that feel good when you, in a different way than just making a book that's about, or like the diary you're working on,
Certainly.
So these different outcomes to these different processes, but this idea of the anti-art age, I think is real, and I don't really know why. What I do know is abhorrent is artists who don't support the expression of other artists in a fashion they don't approve of. I think this is one of the more shocking betrayals that I witnessed over the last decade or so, because it just seems so obvious to me that even if you don't like what this person makes, it would be important to preserve their ability to do so, or at least be supportive of other artists.
Yeah, there's something I was thinking, like I saw an interview with Dave Chappelle where he's talking about how he views himself as a comedian first and black second. Mm-hmm. And it made me really sad in a way, because I was like, it kind of back to the idea of community that we started talking about, is like I feel like there's not many artists that are like, I view myself as a comic artist and kind of working to try to make more of a, it's like, if you work in comics, I feel like your worst enemies are other people that like comics. And that's always a really hilarious idea to me. Like there's definitely people existing in the world that hate the idea of me. And, most of them have never met me. And not to sound too narcissistic, but I mean, it's like, there's people that hate anyone that has any minor public figure version of it, like that was an interesting thing when I was doing the Kanye West work, is I would meet people that had these. I remember going out to dinner with a friend and he brought his girlfriend along, and she was so convinced. She was like, he's clearly gay. And I was like, I don't think he is, but that's fine. But she had such a clear idea about it. And that's a weird idea. And also the idea of just like how the kind of crabs in the bucket comics community is really frustrating to me, because it's like, it is like, I'd be really interested in I've never had an honest conversation with somebody who like dramatically disagrees with me, like their idea of me, or even the idea of like my take on art. And I wonder what that would be like. It's something I think about a lot but yeah, it's
you never will. They'll never have that conversation with you.
Yeah, I guess not. But
they don't want to. Whoever they may be in that sentence. There's a world of appearance, and then there's the world of being. Sure. And obviously, the world is increasingly one of appearance.
Yeah, and I think that's very frustrating. That's been a weird. I think I mentioned before about why Los Angeles is weird to me, and that's people caring about how other people view them is a very weird. I guess I understand it. It just seems like it seems like a weakness to me.
Oh, it is. It's pretty much objectively a weakness. as you mentioned earlier, you need to be tethered to something eternal if you want an outcome that's different, I think. I've always found that interesting about Obi-Wan, since I was a little kid, I was like, okay, he clearly didn't even try there and he died. I don't know if that's just bad acting, but I don't think it is. Like he lets himself die.
Yeah.
And when you're like a little kid or maybe, whatever, you're like between 8 and 10, you're definitely grappling with the magic of the world, but starting to skew towards a more materialist view. So the idea of dying in this world to kind of gain some weird upper hand in the spiritual or inspirational sense, I think is bizarre. But it was in some ways like life-changing to me, that idea.
Yeah, it's interesting because, something that we contend with in life is just like how much like I was thinking like Herman Melville, the guy that wrote Moby Dick, like if I remember right, Moby Dick, like he never really saw the book's success.
Yeah. That's kind of beautiful to me.
Yeah, and something like that is really fascinating because I have to kind of break myself sometimes of being like hyper focused on like how are strangers going to think about my work, and then just realize it's not up to you. And like the idea of
you don't control that.
Yeah, and then we get all these other, I don't know, for some, it was making me think of Ed Piskor, the idea of like what Ed is now is such a totally different animal to what he was during his life.
Sure. It's deep. It's deeply complex, and it's just sad. It's like, it's just sad to me in the sense of, I understand that reality is somewhat subjective, but there is still, in my eyes, a capital R reality. And
sure,
it takes precedent, and a lot of the times people behave in certain ways, and this is not a new idea in any sense, but behind a screen. And like you said, a lot of these people who don't like you, they don't talk to you directly or address you directly. And I think that's because humanity is quite frightening, and it's complexity, but there's times where you're mad at someone because of an email, and then you encounter them in real life in the same day, and they, at least in my experience, they kind of melt you because they have eyes, because you see in them like, oh, I forgot they're a person. They're not like just a message.
Yeah. I used to know a guy that I absolutely hated his online presence, but in person, he was always pleasant. And it was really a good reminder all the time to be like, oh, like this is this actual person is a valuable, interesting person. And I just don't like how they conduct themselves in this environment.
Yeah. And I know that the diary touches upon that element, at times, like I was saying, I don't know why people, you don't need to get into it. I don't know why people dislike you, hypothetically. But I think I didn't know Ed, but, I think that was I hope for people, on both sides of it, the ultimate realization that there are some severe limitations to judging people in this context. I kind of saw, like, from what little I saw, there was some irony to people like, oh, this was a witch hunt. But then there was kind of like a reverse witch hunt in which people seemed to be wanting to witch hunt the people who had started it all and calling them out. And it just, for me, it was just like, oh, okay, this is just like an endless cycle.
Yeah, it doesn't really come back to a moment of kind of a healing and advancement from the thing, which is unfortunate. But the difficulty is that everyone thinks they're doing what they're doing for moral reasons, which I think is a good thing to be reminded of, that being a dick because you have a morality behind you doesn't stop you from being a dick,
Yeah, there's one thing that of my, I don't know, couple of years of being into Alan Watts, I really took to heart, and it was beware of the do-gooders. Basically, the do-gooders are the most dangerous people.
Yeah, and I think
because there's nothing they'll stop at. They've already convinced themselves they're doing good, so why would they? They can justify anything,
Yeah,
I see a lot of that shit.
Totally. And I've realized that a lot of the people that I really trust in my own life have been people who don't think they're doing well. I mentioned my friend Farrell a bunch of times. He's really hard on himself, and he's like, he'll worry a lot about if he's being a good person, if he's doing the right thing. And it's made me really regard him as like a moral compass in some ways. Guys like him, or like a Craig Thompson, is somebody who's like really concerned about how he treats people, and it causes him to treat people especially well. And then I've known people on the other side of that where they're just like, oh, I'm doing the right thing here, and they're just making the world a worse place.
I mean, that's personally why I've always found the tenet of Christianity that you're just outright a sinner to start. I've always found that helpful, morally speaking, because although you can be forgiven, and I think redemption is an important, like, I think culturally we just completely lack redemption, which is horrifying. But this weird cycle that, like, you're not supposed to gamify and be like, well, I can sin and then just confess and then die and then I'll go to, like, you're supposed to kind of grapple with that strange aspect of life that I think there's a lot of fertile soil, morally speaking, when you are very critical of yourself. And even artistically speaking, the best artists I know are absolutely convinced that they're not good artists. Yeah, and that's a weird line to walk, because I feel like there's a value in the Kanye West, everything I do is amazing. It's almost like you have to kind of have those two sides in you, where you're like, I'm going to do something amazing right now, and I'm going to not doubt this line I'm going to make. And then you need to kind of almost have that as a separate thing from like, okay, now I've done the work. Let me think about it in a critical way before I make the line or something. Just basically being able to balance those two sides to yourself, I think, is really important and difficult. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's like, to me, it's like a piston. You need kind of over the top self-confidence and over the top self-criticality, which is just such a weird thing to possess. Yeah. A lot of, because if you were like, I suck at art, why would you keep doing it? If that was your only mode of thought, Yeah, because for me, something that always really bothered me is when people were self-deprecating, then they asked people to pay for it. I always feel like that's like, you don't value other people's time and money if you're like, this comic's not very good, but it's $11, Sure, yeah, that makes sense. You want to be like, this is worth $11. I tried really hard to make something valuable. Yeah. I often say that, like, human sacrifice in this sense is what we want to see. We want, within mythological structures, like, the sacrifice has to be worthy. It has to be the best thing that you bring to the table. And I think that really applies to art. Yeah. Give people your best years. Give them your health. Give them, I think it's an unavoidable truth in some sense of the process that, like, people can kind of feel that in the work. Yeah. But there's interesting too, like, it makes me think of the manga artist, the guy who did the Kitaro manga, the one-eyed kid. It's like a yokai. Yes. Yeah. I was like, that artist was really adamant about getting 8 hours of sleep every night, and he lived like 20 years longer than all of his peers. Fair. Yeah, no, I'm all about 8 hours. So I would have to agree with that. I mean, the Japanese seem to have a way of doing this. I don't know why, but it seems very balanced. Like, their creators seem very, well, it's not that much of a mystery, I guess, disciplined and kind of like taking care of business. Yeah. But something I think I agree about Miyazaki about a lot is the idea of like sometimes I'll read manga or watch anime or something, and it feels like it's made by someone who has an experienced life, like, mm-hmm. Like, there's a type of almost like Wikipedia writing, I think of it as, where someone will be like, here's the facts of how this is done, and then the characters do this, but it doesn't feel like there's none of the kind of je ne sais quoi feeling of like, this is coming from someone's own life experience. This person knows what it's like to build a fire versus they read an article about building a fire. It's true. I mean, if you read his 2 books, Starting Point and Turning Point.
Oh yeah, I have those here.
Definitely goes into what he witnessed, war-wise, etc. He also just is like, he embodies that human paradox very well, where he's in love with warplanes, but he hates war. I think that's what we're lacking when we talk about. It's not even that we lack like a counterculture. We lack that counter. We lack that. I don't know how to describe it, but I suppose humans can try to simplify themselves down into like a product, even politically, where they simply are one thing that you can come to depend on.
Yeah.
But this isn't human. This is something else. And I often forget that like he's somewhat controversial, especially The Wind Rises. People found that controversial, or the fact that he depicts people smoking cigarettes. People get upset about, but even the fact that he seems to be like, I don't know what his life, but it seems somewhat evident that he was not terribly interested in being a father, but that is kind of the soil that The Boy and the Heron grows out of. So,
interesting. It's
kind of this, I think it's poetry. I think that what we're skirting around is the lack of poetry in people's vision. I remember some like kind of seemingly insane dude handed me this like pamphlet in New York City.
Uh-huh.
You know how that goes. But I think it said something like, how can there be a revolution without a political revolution without a poetic spirit?
Sure.
And I was like, that is the crux, because I look back and I go, how did the hippies, how were they cool with Burroughs just fucking little boys and shooting his wife? And I'm not saying these are good things, or Ginsberg, I don't know if they were just completely amoral or immoral, but they seem to be able to understand that.
I think they're putting art ahead of, I think there's a criticism that people have of the hippies too, is I think that a lot of them were putting artistic achievement ahead of morality, which I personally value, because I think that Burroughs and Ginsberg are super fascinating. They're fantastic writers. I can't get through a Burroughs novel because he writes like someone on heroin, but his prose is beautiful, and it is kind of stuff where he is experienced this crazy life where he's essentially like, he murdered his wife and is pretty, so much of his work is just like sexualizing teenage boys, but like there's value in him as a complex person.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying it's simple, right? Like,
yeah, that's interesting, because it's not simple, because like we can say those things and like like if I was like, hey, you want to hang out with a guy, and like, what's he like? And be like, well, he's a murderer who's a pedophile. You'd be like, no, I never want to meet that person. But that's the weird thing about his art, is that there's value in it. Even some of his actions are seemingly abhorrent.
Yeah, that's I understand that people want to change that.
The funny thing is, none of those guys are actually very controversial figures. You know what I mean? Like
that's the obscene part. Yeah.
Yeah, where we put our morality is really funny, because you can mention like J.K. Rowling is more controversial than Burroughs right now, to mention.
Sure, and David Bowie was like literally a Nazi for 2 years or some shit. I can't remember how long the Thin White Duke occurred, but the man had an entire alter ego based on that.
Oh, sure. Or at least he was playing at it, which I think is like an interesting thing now, is like I don't know if artists are allowed to play as much as they were.
No, they're definitely not. I mean, I think the sense of, so that's what I believe, the sense of play. I mean, with Bowie, it's hard to tell when he was playing at something, especially when he was coked out of his mind. But the sense of play in poetry is definitely reducing, but also like the non-artist's ability to actually comprehend that maybe was never there, but they didn't have the ability to kind of hunt the artist down as much now.
Yeah.
So I would,
Yeah, that is an interesting thing of like I think now if you're gonna, like I was talking earlier, like if you're gonna not engage with people, it's like a active not engaging as opposed to a passive that it would be in the past. Like, you know, like if in the 1980s you would have to, if you're a musician, you could go to concerts, or say you're a comic artist in the 1980s, you'd have to go to a convention or hang out at a comic store, you know, talking to people to get their impression of your work. And neither of those are environments where you would run into anything hostile in the same way that you can just Googling your own name.
do you Google your name often?
I don't. I purposely don't. Like but it's an active thing, you know. And it's funny.
You actively do not.
I actively do not, and it's funny because I'm friends with some people who struggle with it. Like they'll, you know, I'll talk to other comic people who are just like, oh, I made a mistake today and looked at my name and feel really bad because people were saying bad things about me. And I kind of at this point don't understand. I'm like, it's easy to not do that, but I understand everyone wants the dopamines. You know, everybody's like, oh, what if somebody says something good about me? And for me, it's a reminder of like, if you read a review of your work and they call you a genius, you kind of don't believe them. And if you read a review and they call you a hack, then you're like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. You know, there's not really any real value from that.
No, not at all.
Although there was a fun time where I felt like I was doing work and I could kind of play with expectations, but I kind of felt like the internet was a less hostile place in previous decades where I could like put out work and be like, you know, people would be like, oh, I want my King City book. I had a really good editor on it that would basically give me like his impressions of what should happen next. And I would always play off of that. And I felt like that created a really fun back and forth. Like, well, at the end of, I won't ruin it for anyone, hopefully, but the end of King City, I did kind of I kind of didn't give the ending that was promised and trade for kind of an emotional ending. So the main character is supposed to go off and fight the kind of big villain in it. And he's just like, that's not, you know, there's no point in me doing that. That's not my fight. And a lot of that was just because of the back and forth I was having with people where they were like, I'm really excited to see this thing. And I was like, well, that's the ABC of every story, is like, you have this like big confrontation and win. And I was like, but that's not really giving anything new. And that's not really, it's not really speaking on anything in life. Like I always think about like the couple fights I've been in life have really affected how I draw fighting. And like I worked at a bar for a little bit and like none of it was good. Like if somebody punches somebody, it's just like, there's not a lot of heroism in it. And there's not a lot of, like, it's just messy and awkward and everyone feels bad and their faces hurt afterwards, you know? And so it changes things when I'm drawing fight scenes and me being like, this is not, like, it's cool to watch a Jackie Chan movie and get all that stuff in there, and there's an element to that. But if you're conveying your real life experience, then I don't really have any of that in me where that's a positive, good thing that ends things well, you know?
Yeah, I understand. I see my local library has that book, so I will read that book. King City, right?
Yeah.
So that will be the first outside of the diary. So when does the diary come out? Comes out physically?
Yeah. So we're doing an interesting thing with it where Living the Line has got like a pre-sale thing they do. So we do a Kickstarter where people can kind of pre-order the thing and get a bunch of extras and things. We often do like secondary little zine books with things and sketches and signed copies and things. And that helps fund the book. And then we also run it through Diamond Distribution and put it in comic stores and bookstores.
And when's that coming out?
I think it's about 4 months from now.
So what you sent me is its final form, or you think you'll keep tacking on?
I mean, that's the final form because I think it's 110 pages right now.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's it I'm going to go through and kind of polish those a little bit.
It's a weird mix of like font that I made off of my hand lettering. And because it's like, a lot of it's sketchbook stuff, a lot of it's really, really kind of messy and hand done. So I'll probably tweak it slightly, but I think the version you read is pretty close. And something that's really fascinating about putting it together is it was the first time I've ever made a book where I rearranged the pages from the order that they were done in, because I wanted to kind of present it to people in a certain order. You know, and I feel like there's some heavy stuff in there. Like I talk about like death and suicide and a bunch of things like that. And so I almost wanted to be like, like even in the book, I talk about this idea of like the Japanese hot dog game show, where the goal of the game show is to get somebody to wake up a person sleepy and get them to eat a hot dog as quick as possible. And I think that in a storytelling sense of like if you give someone a wall of text or something really dramatic on page one, it's like giving someone a hot dog for breakfast. And I was like, oh, geez, but you know, getting someone to drink a glass of water on page one is not as hard as a hot dog. So you want to be like, hey, come into this comic. Here's a simple idea. Let's get into it, and then we can get into some heavier stuff.
So that's, you were pushing things around to get that flow a little better.
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. All right, so people need to be on the lookout for that. I do sleep at normal times, so I'm approaching my bedtime.
Oh yeah. Well, thanks for letting me talk your ear off here.
All good. Happy to. We went on, I don't even know if it was coherent, but we'll let the listeners decide that.
Sure.
But I don't mind. You know, in a sense, it's like the diary. There's kind of we're just chunking it up.
Certainly.
So thank you for your time.
Excellent. Well, good talking to you, Michael.
Have a good night.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Bye.
Music by Dori Bavarsky and Mingja Chen. Next up, we have Mike Makatau Pelchinski. Enjoy your week.